Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Wolf Brune. I'm director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Dan Stone from the UK. He is one of the most, let's say, well-known scholars in the field of Holocaust studies and also in the field of genocide studies. He teaches at Royal Holloway, University of London, and we know each other, although we don't know each other really well. We just found, I remember that we met in 2005, but we didn't really talk. But this was actually a very crucial moment for genocide studies. We met in Berlin at the kind of foundational meeting for a new network of genocide scholars, kind of younger scholars who were a little bit displeased with the kind of achievements and the development of genocide studies as a whole at this time. And I think from there, in 2005 till now, the whole field of genocide studies had kind of really getting much more professional profile. I think it's much more academic than it was before, and it's also, although it's interdisciplinary, it's much more now heavier on the history side, which helped to really increase the groundwork in genocide studies. Dan Stone is much more famous for actually looking over this and how historiography develops over time in Holocaust studies and also the field of genocide studies. I can't really tell you everything about him because he is the author or editor of more than a dozen books and over 70 articles. He more or less started with a book on eugenics, and which was called, with a very nice title, Breeding Superman, which more people can relate to, in 2002. And then he really got his name out by publishing several books on the development of the historiography of the Holocaust. Right now he is working on, or has worked on, the history of the concentration camps, which we will talk about in this talk. This is one project is a short introduction into the history of these concentration camps for Oxford University Press. And so give him a warm hand and welcome.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. It's my first time in California, and it's very nice to be here. As Bob said, I'm just finishing writing this little book on concentration camps for Oxford's very short introduction series, which is why I thought I'd test some of the ideas on you and see what you think. Any sort of book like that, which has a maximum word limit stipulated by the press of 35,000 words, means that I'm trying to compress an enormous amount of global history into a very short space, with the inevitable shortcomings that involves. So if you think I haven't said enough about X, Y, or Z, please say so, but you, I think, will be able to anticipate my answer in advance. And of course, what I'm going to say now is a compressed version of an already compressed work. So I will try and be as wide-ranging as possible and give as many examples as possible. But you'll see one of the things I'm not going to talk about today is either the Nazi camp system or the Stalinist gulag, which we can talk about, certainly afterwards, but you'll see why I don't talk explicitly about them in the lecture. Zygmunt Bauman has offered one of the more memorable assessments of concentration camps, with his pithy claim that just as the 18th century was the age of reason and the 19th the age of progress, so the 20th century will be remembered as the century of camps. The camps, he writes, following Hannah Arendt, were distillations of an essence diluted elsewhere, condensations of totalitarian domination and its corollary, the superfluity of man, in a pure form difficult or impossible to achieve elsewhere. The camps were patterns and blueprints for the totalitarian society, that modern dream of total order, domination and mastery run wild, cleansed of the last vestiges of that wayward and unpredictable human freedom, spontaneity and unpredictability that held it back. The camps, says Bauman, were testing grounds for societies run as concentration camps. It seems to me that there's a striking mismatch between this sort of philosophical attempt to account for the meaning of concentration camps and historical studies which examine the development, running, staffing, and victims' experiences of camps as they appeared in particular settings. This lecture will consider the historiography of concentration camps, showing how histories of individual camp systems and individual camps mean we now have a detailed understanding of how camps arose, developed, and in many cases closed, although the scholarship is much better developed in some cases than others. This body of literature now allows historians to ask whether concentration camps should be considered from a transnational perspective, the global portability of the concentration camp, as Klaus Mühlhahn puts it. Did regimes learn from one another's practices? Were ideas about incarceration passed on by particular experts or by the press or concerned commentators? Were the specific practices engaged in at concentration camps, such as the use of barbed wire, torture, ritual humiliation, or forced labour, shared ideas, or did they emerge spontaneously across the globe? The answers shed light on camps as one of the 20th century's most notable inventions. I'll suggest that this history, paying attention to history and close reading of the historical development of camp systems, should make us wary of accepting some of the most influential philosophical accounts of the meaning of concentration camps, such as Bauman's, insofar as these argue on the basis of an archetypal and ahistorical camp. Philosophers and sociologists have asked whether concentration camps are laboratories of violence, Wolfgang Zofsky, or places for the eradication of man, Hannah Arendt. They have claimed that the camp's victims are reduced to bare life, that is, non-people whom the guards can kill with impunity, and that this biopolitical control, combined with the normalizing of the state of exception, reveals that camps are the nomos of the modern. That's Giorgio Agamben, whatever that means, the nomos of the modern. Still, despite talking past one another, in many ways these apparently discrete worlds of scholarship, the historical on the one hand, the sociological or philosophical on the other, share common ground, and together they can help us understand why and how concentration camps emerged when they did, and why studying them, however unpleasant, remains crucial for understanding the 20th century world. When I started writing this book, I thought, oh, it won't be too bad, I'll just write about different concentration camp systems as they've appeared in different settings across the world. But as soon as you start thinking about what is a concentration camp, actually it's not as simple as it might at first appear. I'll try and explain why. On the one hand, I came up with a working definition, and that is that a concentration camp is an enclosed site used to hold against their will and without due legal process a group of civilians deemed unwanted by a regime. On the other hand, and thanks mainly to the association of concentration camps with the Third Reich, we tend to think of concentration camps as places where the law has been abandoned, spaces of exception, where the inmates are set against one another and where they are at the mercy of the guards' whims. The imagery of barbed wire, guard towers, machine gun emplacements, and ironic slogans over the entrance gates completes the picture. That's all well and good until we consider some questions which complicate the story. What if we take seriously the notion that camps in South Africa were set up by the British primarily with the aim of preventing a rural population whose land had been destroyed by the British Army's scorched earth policy from supporting Boer guerrillas, and not as punishment camps? What if we consider the cases of people interned against their will because of racial and political paranoia, such as citizens of many European countries during World War I, Japanese Americans, or German Jewish enemy aliens during World War II, Jewish displaced persons at the end of World War II, either in Germany and Austria, or even more problematically, in the camps set up by the British in Cyprus, where Jews who had made the illegal crossing to Palestine were held until the establishment of Israel. What happens to our understanding of camps when we discover that in the Soviet Gulag there were prisoners who were granted the right to live outside the zone, so-called zazonniki, who could move about unguarded? How should we deal with the liberal countries' use of camps, in which brutal torture and mistreatment were rife, in the context of decolonization in Malaya, Kenya, or Algeria? None of the people in these camps wanted to be there, but can we say that they are in each case a surplus population abandoned to their fate and deprived of the law? The case of Guantanamo is especially disconcerting here. Few would dispute that it's a shocking abuse of power and that it's wrong to hold people for years solely on the basis of suspicion. But is it, as some commentators hold, a concentration camp? Are favelas, slums, sweatshops, or enclosed territories such as the Gaza Strip huge open-air concentration camps? There are those who believe so. If all of these sites are concentration camps, then we rapidly come to the conclusion that there is no archetypal camp, that a camp need not look like Dachau in order to qualify as such, and that the concept of the concentration camp, therefore, needs to be historicized, for what it designates changes over time. Concentration camps didn't appear out of nowhere. There's a long history of incarceration that includes workshops, POW camps, asylums, slavery plantations, quarantine islands, and prisons. The idea of isolating unwanted population groups precedes the modern age. The most important precedent is to be found in the European overseas colonies, spaces of exception from European law, places in which, as Hannah Arendt argued, anything was possible. The consistent, forced relocation of American Indians, the forcing off the land of Aborigines in Australia, the wiping out of whole populations such as the San Bushmen or the Caribs, were all justified on the grounds that the natives were not able to follow the laws of civilized warfare. Specific cases, such as Flinders Island off the coast of Tasmania or Shark Island off the Namibian coast, are very close approximations of concentration camps, except that they were ready-made rather than constructed. Indeed, the first wave of camps to be known as concentration camps were located in the European colonies: Cuba, South Africa, the Philippines, German Southwest Africa. In the first three of these places, concentration camps were established primarily as a military solution to guerrilla warfare. By removing the displaced rural population, guerrilla fighters would lose their source of food, shelter, and morale, and the civilian authorities could engage in social engineering. German Southwest Africa is slightly different. Here the camps were established after the war, more as a means of pacifying and humiliating a defeated enemy and forcing them into slave labor rather than a counter-guerrilla strategy. Revealingly though, given that the term Konzentrationslager had been used in German up to that point to refer to the British camps in South Africa, it's clear that the British experience in their guerrilla war was regarded as some kind of guide by the Germans. Klaus Mühlhahn writes that the global history of concentration camps shows that they first emerged in the non-Western world within the historical context of colonial rule, which reinforced the assumptions of white superiority, justified the use of violence against colonial populations, and proliferated ideas of ethnic and/or political cleansing. That's probably not contentious. His following statement is more interesting, however. This is what Mühlhahn writes. Global connections and transfers moved the military and policing doctrines from the European colonial domains to the European continent itself, where the implementation of those practices facilitated the shift to total war and also helped shape a new brutality displayed by European armies towards non-combatants during and after World War I. This claim makes assumptions about the transnational nature of concentration camps that needs to be tested. Perhaps, following anthropological models, we might in fact discover that similar ideas arose less through diffusion, in other words, the transnational sharing of ideas, than through parallel development. In other words, that the camps were one expression of structural similarities and family resemblances in modern global history that emerged spontaneously in different locations. There's obviously a fashion for the transnational to prove that these practices were shared and passed on between regimes. But I think there's a good argument for also suggesting that camps emerged. I'm not, of course, denying that there are transnational practices. I'll refer to some of them soon. But there's a good argument for saying that camps emerge as a result of the specific structural conditions of the modern world at a particular point in time as well. I think that's worth bearing in mind. I want to suggest that the most compelling reason for the redeployment in Europe of these colonial practices was the First World War. During this conflict, not only were prisoners of war taken in numbers previously unseen, but so were civilians interned and subjected to all manner of suffering in enormous numbers. Some 8 to 9 million POWs were held during the war, 2.2 million in Russia alone. Nor was this only a European problem, with German POWs being held in Japan, albeit in small numbers. POW camps cannot, by definition, be considered concentration camps because they hold soldiers, not civilians. But the sheer scale of them during the First World War, not to mention the high death rates in them, tells us something about the modern state's ability and willingness to intern huge numbers of people. In the era of total war, this willingness to intern then impacted most forcefully on civilians. As historian of the POW camps, Heather Jones notes, in the First World War, the prisoner of war camp began the conflict as a means of ensuring that the captured enemy combatant was kept away from rejoining the battlefield fight. In other words, with a purely military function. It ended the war as a sophisticated system of state control and as a laboratory for new ways of managing mass confinement, forced labour, and new forms of state-military collaboration. Even more significant for later developments was the internment of civilians during World War I, and not only in Europe. In 1915, in a move that had enormous ramifications for the rest of the 20th century and beyond, France revoked the status of naturalized citizens from people of enemy origin. Belgium, Italy, Austria, and Germany soon followed suit, with the result that the idea that one could be stripped of one's nationality and reduced to statelessness and thus deprived of the benefit of law, this being long before the UN Refugee Convention, of course, became normal. British civilians in Germany, for example, were held in the Engländerlager Ruhleben near Berlin. In total, by the end of the war, some 111,879 enemy civilians were in German internment. 24,255 German, Austrian, and Hungarian citizens were still interned in Britain at the same point, October 1918. The Austro-Hungarians deported French and Belgian citizens for forced labour, and Italian citizens of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for being, as they put it, out of place. They were either interned or deported to Italy. From the 20th of May 1915, they were held in what were called concentration camps, one of which, at Steinklam, the Italians referred to as the Campo della Morte, the camp of death. The internees were treated very harshly, forced to work for little pay, and received inadequate food supplies. The Italian Royal Commission of Investigation noted, in fact, that, quote, the really tragic characteristic of these concentration camps was the hunger. And in the face of the large number of deaths, especially of children, claimed that the Austrians intended, quote, to destroy or reduce to a small number the Italian race on its territories. The Austrians also rounded up some 7,000 so-called Russophiles in eastern Galicia and Bukovina and deported them to the Thalerhof camp near Graz, where nearly 1,500 died. In the colonies, German priests and civilians in Togo and Cameroon were rounded up and interned first in Dahomey and later in Algeria and Morocco. And in British East Africa, German civilians were deported to camps in India. The war also witnessed refugee movements on a huge scale. The Russian Revolution of 1917 created about 1.5 million refugees. And even before that, by mid-1916, as a result of the war, in Russia's larger cities, refugees made up more than 10% of the population. In Kharkov, it was 25%, and in Samara, 30%. There were philanthropic efforts to help them, but these were insufficient to counter the power of a nationalist language of floods, swarms, deluges, and other biblical disasters, which quickly became associated with refugees across Europe. The Times of London, for example, described Belgian refugees in Britain as a peaceful invasion, whilst Russian commentators used even more colourful terms such as lava or avalanche to describe refugees. These population movements saw emergency accommodation being created in schools, factories, barracks, monasteries, and so on, and the creation for the first time on European soil of refugee camps. The refugees were not always grateful, however. Belgians in Britain, for example, were constrained by the Aliens Restriction Act, 1914, confining them to specific parts of the country. They complained that this amounted to being held in, quote, a concentration camp. Whether undertaken out of fear of fifth columnists, as reprisal actions, or in order to obtain forced labourers, the scale of civilian internment during the war was far greater than anything that had been witnessed before. Perhaps more important than the sheer fact or simply the number of civilians held in camps is the reason for their being so held. This is the point at which the emerging nation states, as well as more established ones, became gripped by fears of fifth columnists, by paranoid fantasies of enemies within, and a fascination for racial and national homogeneity, which rendered civilians with foreign descent suspect in the eyes of patriots and nationalists. The logical extension of this fear was the declaration of a state of emergency, a state which France, for example, remained in from 1914 until 1919. Civilian camps were thus the expression of the break with the liberal rule of law and rule by decree under a state of emergency in which those rendered suspect by irrational political fears were placed in a position of enemy number one, with the result that when rendered stateless or denied citizenship rights, they suddenly became very vulnerable indeed. Mulhan claims that the temporary internment of displaced and dislocated groups and POWs in the wake of the war, together with the politicization of citizenship and nationality and the temporary suspension of regular legal procedures, provided the conditio sine qua non that facilitated the emergence of concentration camps on the European continent. In other words, in the global history of concentration camps, the POW and civilian camps of the First World War provide closer connections to the later Nazi and Soviet camps than do the colonial concentration camps of southern Africa, where they are usually held to originate. That's a long-winded way of saying that in spite of the fact that when people think of the origins of concentration camps, they think of the Boer War, and then they think of Nazi Germany. Actually, the colonial concentration camps, although they're not irrelevant, don't provide as much of a precedent for the later Nazi and Soviet camps as do the camps created for civilian refugees of World War I. That the correspondence between the colonial camps and the later totalitarian camps is, if not entirely coincidental, also doesn't provide, I think, a satisfactory origin story, if you like. Nowhere is this claim about the importance of World War I more clear than in the context of the Armenian genocide, during which Anatolian Armenians were deported to the deserts of Syria, with many eyewitnesses describing their destination as concentration camps, or even, as in the case of Khatma, death camps. There are lots of witness statements along these lines, but just to give one example from a woman called Naomi Uzunian, written in 1982, quite interesting, a very long time after the events. She's talking about Khatma. The camp, and she puts camp in inverted commas, or rather the editor of the book puts camp in inverted commas. The camp, where hundreds of thousands had already been thrown together, was a narrow strip of the desert, surrounded by bare hills. The hot, humid air was filled with the stench of human refuse and decaying, unburied bodies. I couldn't breathe. Oh, if only I could take a deep breath. The name of this hell was Khatma. Dear Lord, I hope there is no Khatma in the hereafter, and if there is one, forgive my sins and do not condemn me to it, I prayed. Historians of the Armenian genocide agree with this terminology. Hilmar Kaiser talks about the world of the death camps as the genocide became more coordinated and ferocious in 1916. Ron Sunni claims that what he calls the concentration camps at Tel Abyad, Ras Al Ain, Mamure, Khatma and Aleppo were way stations toward extermination. They were death camps, he says. Taner Akçam too says of the concentration camps of Aleppo that, quote, the appalling sanitary and humanitarian conditions turned these into death camps. These were not camps designed to isolate civilians, but to get rid of them altogether. What's different about 20th century camps from colonial and European sites of incarceration that preceded them is thus the context. First of all, we're talking about civilians, people who have not formally been convicted of any crime. As Arendt noted, criminals do not properly belong in the concentration camps, if only because it is harder to kill the juridical person in a man who is guilty of some crime than in a totally innocent person. They are held against their will because of who they are or what the authorities suspect them of believing or what they might do. That liberal regimes have incarcerated and continue to incarcerate people on this basis is an important reminder that concentration camps are not solely the tool of mad dictators and evil regimes, though we should be clear that the most complete instantiation of camps as laboratories of human behavior occurred in the fascist and communist regimes of the 20th century. Second, it's less the physical appearance of camps that's significant than what they represent, that's to say, the power and the nature of the 20th century state. Although it's true that with the exception of the Soviet special settlements, from which there was little chance of escape across hundreds of miles of tundra, they tend to assume a similar pattern based on conventional prisons, though less accessible to outsiders. Third, the large-scale incarceration of civilians, not because they were diseased physically, but because they were presumed to be diseased mentally or racially, conforms to what we know of the development of modern states. Concentration camps appeared in the age of the modern nation-state, when the drive to establish homogeneous populations, ethnically, nationally, or racially, was common, and when the inability to achieve that goal was put down to the existence of alien population groups. As multinational empires gave way in Europe to homogenizing nation-states, or as new empires, such as the Soviet Union, attempted to mold society in a new image, the threat of enemies and wreckers was inbuilt as something that had to be combated. Concentration camps were novel forms of incarceration because they were the expression of the modern state when it felt itself to be under threat. The high watermark of the use of concentration camps was, of course, in the totalitarian regimes of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union. But this does not necessarily justify Arendt's assertion that these camps are the true central institution of totalitarian organizational power, since camps have occurred in numerous settings across the world. In the cases of Francoist Spain, fascist Italy, communist China, Cambodia, or North Korea, or in the right-wing dictatorships of Argentina and Chile, the spread of camps combined the diffusion of camp technologies with specific local conditions and national traditions. Even the Nazi and Soviet camps were not particularly bound to one another. Contrary to Ernst Nolte's claim that Hitler's camps were inspired by a Soviet model, the Germans had already looked to the British for the terminology, as I already mentioned, and to Southwest Africa for the practice. And they'd also officially named as Konzentrationslager 2 former POW camps reopened in 1921 to hold unwanted foreigners, that's to say Ostjuden, Jews from Poland. These 2 camps, I found a few references here and there, one in Cottbus and one in Stargard. There's not much information about them, but that they existed is not in doubt. Russian military officials too first used the term Konzentrationslager during the Anglo-Boer War, and the Bolsheviks quickly revived the term after the 1917 revolution. But perhaps it's in nationalist China where the evidence for transnational learning is strongest. The Kuomintang was advised not only by American officers, but by General Alexander von Falkenhausen, a colleague of Lothar von Trotha, the man responsible for creating the concentration camps in German Southwest Africa. In Europe, camps became the standard fare of authoritarian regimes. More than 500,000 Spaniards and other Europeans passed through the more than 180 camps which made up the Francoist concentration camp system. The largest, Miranda de Ebro, opened in November 1936 and remained in existence until 1947, long after the end of the Civil War. As of June 1937, they were administered by the Prisoner Concentration Camps Inspectorate, Inspección de Campos de Concentración, a name which is eerily reminiscent of Eicher's Nazi Inspectorate of 1934. Himmler inspected Franco's camps in 1940 as well. And so there is a kind of sharing of interests between Nazi Germany and fascist Spain. In Italy, a fascist archipelago comprising islands such as Ventotene and San Nicola held political prisoners. Later, some 52 fascist concentration camps holding about 10,000 civilians were set up all over Italy between 1940 and 1943, directly influenced by Mussolini's race laws that he introduced in 1938. In other words, primarily for Jews and Gypsies, but also foreign citizens. There are even indications of an attempt to create in 1932 what one historian calls an extermination camp for Italian political prisoners in the Libyan Sahara in Qasr Buhadi, 478 kilometers southeast of Tripoli. Financial constraints meant that it was not built, but the idea shows the logic of fascism's radical exclusion taken to its extreme. In fascist states, concentration camps were central to the functioning of the regime as such. The use of concentration camps in the context of colonial wars and decolonization, such as in Kenya, Malaya, or Algeria, recapitulated the logic of earlier colonial wars in separating guerrillas and civilian supporters and sanctioning exceptional measures that would have been considered unacceptable at home. Several authors refer to the Gulag in the context of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, for example. More people were detained in Kenya than anywhere else in the British Empire, with a maximum of 71,346 detained in December 1954. The vast majority of them, 98%, from Kenya's Kikuyu-speaking Central Highlands. David Anderson calculates that at least 1 in 4 Kikuyu adult males were imprisoned or detained by the British colonial administration at some time between 1952 and 1958. Kenya already had a higher number of prisoners than neighbouring British colonies of Uganda and Tanganyika, but when the so-called emergency began in 1952, numbers increased rapidly. As part of Operation Anvil in 1954, further camps were built, and the use of forced labour, contrary to international law, was sanctioned by Oliver Lyttelton, Secretary of State for the Colonies in Churchill's Tory government. Operation Anvil itself was Gestapo-like, as loudspeakers were set up in Nairobi, and a 25,000-strong security force cordoned off the city to search it sector by sector in order to purge it, a technique that the British had previously deployed in Tel Aviv during the Mandate in Palestine. One historian writes that the Kenyan camps were not wholly different from those in Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia, and suggests more provocatively that in these camps, Britain finally revealed the true nature of its civilizing mission. The slogan placed at the entrance to Aguthi camp, "He who helps himself will also be helped." Clearly, a transnational model has some purchase here, although we lack explanations which prove that the process was a conscious one, and which connect the Kenyan camps to the earlier South African ones, let alone the Nazi ones. Doing so, trying to find a proper transnational explanation for this would mean taking into account the British role in liberating the Nazi camps, particularly Belsen, and how that affected British colonial and military self-perception in the context of decolonisation. It's a very complex dilemma, I think, in the British post-war context. You have an enormous amount of sympathy and even stronger emotions than that for the Jews who'd been liberated by the British in Belsen. An enormous amount of sympathy for them. And then at the same time, primarily because the Jews were not allowed into Palestine, you see the British and the liberated Jews falling out with one another. And in the context of Jewish terrorism in Palestine, there are then in 1947 anti-Jewish riots in several British cities. It's really a strange kind of, to try and understand what's going on in post-war Britain with respect to these camps is quite difficult, I think. Revelations of the torture and brutal rule that characterised the British camps in Kenya has shocked the public in the last decade. The British it suddenly turned out a few years ago that there was a secret archive which had been forgotten about, full of information about Kenya. And I think there are some historians who think there's another secret archive which is yet to be discovered, and I'm sure that's probably true. But the scale of the camp system in Kenya was dwarfed by that established by the French in the context of the Algerian War, 1954 to 62. The difference was that Algeria was considered a part of mainland France, not a colony, and the fight to retain it united almost all shades of French political opinion. During the years of the war, some 2.3 million people were driven out of their villages and resettled in some 2,000 camps de regroupement. In other words, a third of the rural population. The inmates depended on the army for their basic necessities. The hygiene conditions were appalling, and one historian notes that they were no more than fenced-in tent camps. After 1958, with de Gaulle's return to power, plans to improve conditions and turn the camps into new villages were announced, but by 1962, only very few had been built. Unsurprisingly, the camps which were supposed to stem support for guerrillas in Kenya, Algeria, and many other examples from Rhodesia to Vietnam had the opposite effect. And where resettlement succeeded, as in so-called process of villagization in Malaya, it usually did so not because of any economic benefits it generated for a majority, but through sheer force. By contrast with the lack of interest in Britain, in British colonial camps, most people in Britain have forgotten that the British once had an empire. It's quite a curious state of affairs. But by contrast with this lack of interest, the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War has generated a sizable historiography. Indeed, this case is in many ways the most disturbing, since like the internment of His Majesty's most loyal enemy aliens, German and Austrian Jews in wartime Britain, I mean the crazy paranoia that saw the British intern German Jews is really hard to understand now. But in the American case, we're dealing here with a state interning its own citizens or residents. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans came under suspicion. In the anti-Japanese clamor, this statement from leading anti-Japanese campaigner Lieutenant Colonel John DeWitt was typical. I have little confidence that the enemy aliens are law-abiding or loyal in any sense of the word. Some of them, yes. Many, no, particularly the Japanese. I have no confidence in their loyalty whatsoever. I am speaking now of the native-born Japanese, 117,000, and 42,000 in California alone. Ultimately, it was President Roosevelt's decision to intern the Japanese, one he took on the basis of his own personal antipathy, and because anti-Japanese feeling was generally strong. Roger Daniels puts it down to the general racist character of American society. It's kind of a bold statement. Indeed, the decision to intern the Japanese Americans was, according to Daniels, made before Pearl Harbor. The presence of a post office, laundry buildings, a library, and schools, and the fact that internees could receive guests clearly indicate that camps like Tanforan, Minidoka, or Manzanar were not Dachau. Nevertheless, some historians are in no doubt as to what to call them. This is from Tetsuden Kashima. The most accurate overall descriptive term is concentration camp. That is, a barbed wire enclosure where people are interned or incarcerated under armed guard. Some readers might object to the use of this term, believing that it more properly applies to the Nazi camps of World War II. Those European camps were more than just places of confinement, however. Many were established to provide slave labor for the Nazi regime or to conduct mass executions. I contend that such camps are more properly called Nazi slave camps or Nazi death camps. I disagree, and we can discuss why afterwards. Whatever we call them, the experience of internment was not pleasant, and the decision to intern Japanese Americans was hardly a credit to a democratic state. All that really happened, as Daniels says, was that the myth of military necessity was used as a fig leaf for a particular variant of American racism. Indeed, the practice set a precedent for post-war America. At the height of the Cold War, the Emergency Detention Act, 1950, gave the president the right to set up camps, quote, for the detention of persons who there is reasonable grounds to believe will commit or conspire to commit espionage or sabotage. Daniels observed in 1971, when he wrote about this, that any foreseeable use of these concentration camps will be for ideological rather than racial enemies of the Republic. Although the Act was partially repealed by the 1971 Non-Detention Act, Daniels here, I think, presciently foresaw Guantanamo Bay. The liberal country's use of camps is dwarfed by the Chinese camp system, however. Internment in the UK or US represented an authoritarian trend in our home life, as the author of one contemporary study of the policy wrote, suggesting that the spread of illiberal ideas concerning foreigners, citizenship, and national belonging was very hard for the democracies to resist when the fascist countries seemed to be in the ascendant. But in the communist countries, concentration camps were tools of the wholesale reshaping of society and were inseparable from the regime's economic plans. China's massive Laogai system remains understudied. Enough is known, however, for us to agree with the authors of one study that, quote, China endured more than its share of concentration camps during the 20th century. Moreover, they go on, China is the only major world power to have entered the 21st century with a thriving concentration camp system, which has been commonly known as the Laogai system since May 1951. Of course, in China, one cannot refer to concentration camps only to remolding through labor facilities or re-education through labor facilities. The term concentration camps, however, is freely used by emigrants who have published their memoirs abroad, as one might expect. But scholars have also found the term applicable. While considerable variability among the camps is naturally present in a country as large and diverse as China, two scholars write, the living and working conditions in their camps have often evoked the harshness associated with concentration camps, particularly during spikes in the death rate, such as the record-breaking famine of 1959 to 62. Like in the Soviet Union, the Laogai system has also been characterized by the forced settlement of those formerly freed from the camps. When Harry Wu returned to China in 1991 to make a film about the camps for CBS, he met a former prisoner named Zhu. Having served 8 years from 1956 to 64 for counter-revolutionary crimes, Zhu then remained in Xining, the capital of Qinghai province, for a further 27 years. He told Wu that 1/3 of the province's population were resettlement prisoners and their families. Their labor, writes Wu, had been used, he told me, to reclaim wasteland, construct roads, open up mines, and build dams, not just prior to 1979, but throughout the 1980s. In other words, far more so than in the Soviet Union, the labor of Laogai prisoners was economically beneficial to the Chinese Communist Party. The goods manufactured by the prisoners are sold in domestic as well as foreign markets and have become an indispensable component of the national economy. This is hardly surprising when one considers the numbers involved. In 1992, Harry Wu estimated that at least 50 million people had been sentenced to labor reform camps over the previous 40 years, and that 16 to 20 million were still confined in them. Thought reform through labor turned out to be a convenient way of acquiring, quote, a dependable source of wealth, as Liu Riqing, the public security minister, put it at the Communist General Assembly of 1954. Unlike in North Korea, the Laogai system was formally abolished in 2013, but the structure of the system remains. Prison factories, psychiatric prisons, community correction centers, and other forms of extrajudicial incarceration still exist, according to campaigners. As all of the above examples show, and there are many others that could have been examined, concentration camps not only have a global history, they are one of the best indicators and symptoms of the nature of the world system, if we can use that term. So, a few concluding thoughts. In 1949, the American critic Isaac Rosenfeld published an article in Partisan Review entitled "The Meaning of Terror." In this cry of despair, Rosenfeld set out his opinion that the world had been forever sullied. This is what he wrote. Terror is today the main reality because it is the model reality. The concentration camp is the model educational system and the model form of government. War is the model enterprise and the model form of communality. These are abstract propositions, but even so, they are obvious. When we fill them in with experience, they are overwhelming. What does it mean to say that the concentration camp is the model form of government? Surely this is no more than a case of post-war shock. And yet, the recurrence of concentration camps, states' ready recourse to them in all parts of the world, in different political, geographical, and cultural settings, suggests that Rosenfeld might have been onto something. What he captured was the way in which the concentration camp became an expression of modern states, especially fascist states, at a certain historical moment. The German philosopher Karl Jaspers wrote that this reality of concentration camps, this circular movement of torturers and tortures, this loss of humanity threatens human survival in the future. Confronted with the reality of the concentration camps, we are unable to speak. This is a greater danger than the atom bomb, since it represents a threat to the human soul. This may be true, I don't know, but it's also, it seems to me, ahistorical. Concentration camps emerged in the early 20th century as modern states emerged out of older empires, sustained by ideas of nationalism and biological metaphors defining the healthy and valuable on the one hand and the polluting and degenerate on the other. It is in fact possible to historicize the emergence of the concentration camp and to explain why, for all the continuities with social and colonial practices of preceding centuries, the term and the phenomenon arose when they did. The concept of the concentration camp, Javier Rodrigo reminds us, refers not so much to a place with a set of uniform features over space and time, as to the status that has been conferred on such a place. As he notes, concentration camps emerged in many places around the same time, but with distinct local variations, meaning that there is what he calls a cumulative history of concentration camps, with lessons learned, discontinuities, and adaptations to the contexts in which they developed. Rodrigo provides a clear statement of the historical context in which concentration camps emerged in the wake of colonial wars and the First World War. I quote Rodrigo. The concentration camps symbolized the transformation and radicalization of the politics of occupation, which extended from the treatment of political prisoners and prisoners of war to the deportation of civilians, from forced labor in extreme conditions to the hunger and misery occupied peoples were also subjected to. Concentration camps also came to serve as a space for social cleansing and internal politics. Concentration camps then were ways of keeping the unwanted elements at bay and furthermore putting them to use, not only through their labor, which was rarely very productive, but as a warning to wider society too. This was, I think, the more important use of the camps, to warn people to stay in line. The camp, Richard Overy writes, reflected political and social insecurities and a public discourse of fear, part real, part sustained by regimes built on warring ideologies. The concentration camp then was an expression of the centralization of terror, one of the key characteristics of the modern state in the age of nationalism and technology. When the British journalist Alan Moorhead published Eclipse, his book about the defeat of Germany in late 1945, he wrote that probably, as he put it, the least blameworthy of the Germans was what he called the unpolitical boy, who was forced late in the war to don a uniform and fight and die for the Third Reich. There is only one thing possible that one can do for him now, wrote Moorhead. Be vigilant to snap the long chains that lead to the future Belsons before they grow too long. Given the history of the last 70 years, we might wonder whether the world has been engaged in strengthening and tightening those long chains rather than snapping them. There seems little likelihood of future Belsons in Europe, at least for the foreseeable future, though we thought that before Omarska too. But the Chinese Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, the internment of Jewish DPs illegally seeking entry into Palestine on British-controlled Cyprus, the holding of anti-colonial rebels in Malaya and Kenya, the continued existence of the Gulag in the post-war Soviet Union, even in its scaled-down version, the Khmer Rouge's country as concentration camp, the rape camps of Bosnia, Guantanamo Bay's suspension of the rule of law, the still existing North Korean camp system, to name just the most obvious, all suggest that concentration camps, or things like them, have not only not disappeared, they have become an all too ubiquitous characteristic of our world. And no surprise, we live in a world where interstate competition encourages inter-community tensions, where the war on terror breeds the thing it is supposedly suppressing, where legal protection of human rights and the commemoration of heroes of the Holocaust, such as Nicholas Winton, goes hand in hand with contempt for refugees who are pushed into makeshift camps or interned in the euphemistically named detention centres. Concentration camps are the compressed and condensed values of the state when it feels itself most threatened. Could it be that the collective memory of the Nazi camps, cultivated in the West but now widely shared across the world and endorsed by the UN in events such as Holocaust Memorial Day, 27th of January, the date of the liberation of Auschwitz, has diverted our attention from other atrocities? Moorhead predicted something like this in 1945. This is what he wrote in Eclipse. A shudder of horror went round the world when the news of these concentration camps was published, but only, I think, because of the special interest and the special moment in the war. We were engrossed with Germany, and it is perhaps not too subtle to say that since Germany was manifestly beaten, people wanted to have a justification for their fight, a proof that they were engaged against evil. From the German point of view, Belsen was perfectly mistimed. Worse camps existed in Poland, and we took no notice. Dachau was described in the late 1930s, and we did not want to hear. In the midst of the war, 750,000 Indians starved in Bengal because shipping was wanted in other parts, and we were bored. The last living patient has been evacuated from Belsen. The hateful buildings have been burnt down. The physical evidence of all those horrible places will soon have been wiped out. Only the mental danger remains, the danger of indifference. It would be wrong, I think, to argue, and it would be a sort of logical extension of Moorhead's position taken in 1945, that Holocaust memory has been deliberately cultivated to place the focus on suffering Jews at the expense of others. The idea that there's a Holocaust industry is, I think, a slander against those whose enduring interest in the murder of the Jews stems from a very human reaction to so terrible a crime. Yet the enormity of the Nazi murder of the Jews and our understandable fascination with it does mean that other cases of genocide or massive human rights abuse are not always properly understood, especially if they do not look like the Holocaust. It means, too, that the term concentration camps has come to denote places like Dachau, when in fact most of them were quite different, with the result that propagandists exploit the association to overstate the extent of their suffering on the one hand, or that the term is rejected in cases other than Nazi Germany on the other hand. More problematic still, the proliferation of concentration camps since the end of World War II suggests that Moorhead was right. Indifference towards the suffering of others is as common now, in the age of immediately available electronic news media, as it was between the wars. Survivor of the Nazi camps, Boris Pahor, a Slovenian writer, claimed that modern Europeans are basically thoughtless and cowardly, that they have become used to a comfortable existence. Today's standardized man, he surmised, may be awakened, who knows, only by some new lay order that dons striped camp burlaps and floods the capitals of our countries, unsettling the complacency of shopping malls with the harsh clatter of their wooden clogs. The response from most of Europe's leaders, as Syrian refugees sought assistance in fleeing one of the most destructive wars in recent history, suggests that Pahor may have been too optimistic. The majority of the world's population does not live in concentration camps. That claim is more polemic or call to action
than an accurate description of the facts. But many commentators lay claim to the concentration camp metaphor when discussing Bangladeshi textile factories, Guantanamo Bay, the Gaza Strip, and so on. And the fact that they do that, I think, should at least lead us to consider the inequalities that define our world and the threat of greater conflict to come in an age of climate change. The claim that the camp could be our future, or that the camp represents the secret inner workings of the modern state, if not entirely persuasive because it's ahistorical, should certainly make us pause for thought before deciding that concentration camps are the products only, as I said before, of mad dictators and their blind followers. This is a rather depressing subject, isn't it? There is an alternative history that can be written about the state as representing people, not controlling them, of nurturing populations through education, health programs, and access to welfare in a way that creates critically engaged citizens rather than downtrodden, suspiciously regarded subjects. One could be forgiven, however, for thinking that that history is indeed well and truly over for many of the inhabitants of our planet. And those of us who are more fortunate, who live in places where a vestige of the post-war social democratic settlement still survives, might do well to watch our backs. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor is open for questions or comments.
Can I start with an easy question? Could you reread
that makes me suspicious when people say things like that.
Could you reread your definition of concentration?
Yes, okay, that is straightforward. Working definition. This is not, this is to be tested. A concentration camp is an enclosed site used to hold against their will and without due legal process a group of civilians deemed unwanted by a regime. That was the best I could come up with. It was very hard when I started to think about it. As soon as you ask the question, what is the difference between a concentration camp and a detention camp, an internment camp, a displaced persons camp, an internally displaced persons camp, a refugee center, and so on and so forth. Suddenly, the simplicity of the whole thing falls apart, and you're left with some quite difficult decisions to make about what is and what isn't.
Do people ever draw links between concentration camps and what they call mass incarceration here in the United States?
Yes, I didn't mention it here, but the idea of the golden gulag, the enormous growth of the prison system in California, particularly, is something that has been discussed. I mean, there's a book of that title, which is called The Golden Gulag, and has a subtitle something to do with prisons, power, money, and so on. It's about, it cites something like a 450% increase in prisoner numbers in California since the 1980s, and suggests that this is the result of what other campaigners call the school-to-prison pipeline. In other words, that within California, and particularly, there are people from deprived backgrounds are more likely, instead of programs designed to help them get out of poverty, and so they're more likely to pass through a trajectory which leads directly from school to youth detention and then henceforth to prison. So yes, that has been much discussed, but I mean, particularly here, I think probably other people here are better qualified to talk about it than I am. It seems to me in its own right, an extremely important topic, and obviously the problem of incarceration, not just in the US, but in Britain as well, and other places, is a very serious one. But I was interested in it more because of the metaphorical use of the term gulag than because I really think that those constitute concentration camps as such. But the comparison is revealing, in a sense, isn't it, of fears about what is going on.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a lot of to think about. Sticking a little bit to definition problems. So I'm kind of a little bit hesitating to think about all of them as one kind of description fits all, because for me there's a line between for example, camps for confinement of the population, that means families, and camps where you detain males or females. So there are, especially when you think about, let's say, the Gulag system, where there is no family kind of relocation. It's a different system. And I say this when you think about colonial camps, they are usually for the remaining population after whether, let's say, a genocidal campaign or a civil war. And this leads to the second problem. We think always about concentration camp, and then it's kind of confused with death camp. Because of the Nazi, the Third Reich. So is it really good to kind of mesh them together, or are these different functionalities or different purposes of camp should be actually rather separated? And just because people use these terms, does this really need a kind of is convincing just by the use? So I'm kind of struggling with this, so death camps, concentration camps, and also families and, let's say, just one gender. The last one, what I was mentioned is you kind of put the emphasis on the emergence of the 19th century, but the colonial system is much older. And if you think about relocation of population, you have this already in the Spanish colonialism. And you have the kind of, you have actually both. You have relocation and you have even death camps, in, if you want. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on your thinking about these difficulties. Sorry for.
Okay. The second point is the easiest one. I mean, I didn't say it explicitly here, but I say it explicitly in the book that I'm not talking about death camps. That a concentration camp is not normally, I say normally, is not normally a death camp, and that Chełmno, which in any case was not really a camp in any kind of meaningful sense, but the Operation Reinhard camps, Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, are not going to be discussed because they're separate from the SS-administered concentration camp system, and that this is a somewhat different phenomenon. But it's not.
Can I just jump in here? You mentioned Flinders Island, which I would actually put more into a death camp than in a concentration camp, because it was a kind of biological solution with no provided shelter, no food provision. So we are on a kind of mid-term distance, this was extermination.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what you're saying is really confirming my starting point, which is that there's no very clear cut. I mean, I thought, although I'm talking about them all within this notion of concentration camps, I thought the burden of what I was saying was that there is no single archetype of the camp in the way that Bauman or Agamben or others would have it. And so I'm trying to be expansive, if you like, and say, yes, I think it's okay to use the term, but only if we accept that this covers it's an umbrella term and it covers a wide variety of things. And with respect to concentration camps and death camps, I'd say that it's also not clear cut. That although I would say yes, let's say the Reinhard camps are separate are different from Sachsenhausen and Dachau and Ravensbrück. Nevertheless, there is also, of course, in terms of the unfolding of the final solution, a continuity between them. And there are, of course, the cases of Majdanek and Auschwitz, which combine the functions of concentration camps and death camps. So it's not so straightforward. And in the case of Flinders, I'd say, again, this confirms the problem of writing about this kind of thing, that yes, we could call it a death camp, but what was in the minds of the people who put them on it? Was it intended as a death camp? And clearly no provision was made for their survival. But is the act of omission the same as the act of commission? And that's maybe it is.
And then you have the Armenian camps, which actually are providing the same situation. You have also the Guerrero in the desert. They're very similar.
Yes. But there's still, I think, a conceptual difference between simply dumping people somewhere and actually establishing facilities to kill them. I mean, it doesn't make any difference to the deaths of those people, but in terms of the behavior of the state, I think it's another step in terms of a genocidal mindset, I think. So that's maybe one way to address that. The other point, with respect to families and so on, again, I'm not sure it's quite so clear cut. It depends. I've got a separate chapter on the Gulag in the book, and there I write about the fact that the Gulag doesn't simply comprise the Great Terror, but that there were many different varieties of Soviet camps. And if we think about the deportation of the so-called punished peoples as also falling into the category of the Gulag, then there are family groups deported, and lots of, the deportation of the Chechens, for example, to Kazakhstan or to Siberia. There are lots of stories that are now collected in various oral history collections of whole families being dumped in the middle of nowhere. The same problem, just being sent where there are no resources and people being told, yeah, you can live here. So there are cases where you might see families being deported together, but that's only if you want to see those deportations as part of the Gulag in the very broadest sense, which I've chosen to do in the book. The third one, I'm not qualified to talk about the earlier Spanish colonial system, but I think that there's a good reason for focusing on the late 19th, early 20th century, because this is the period when you see the most intense competition within the imperial system, and when you see the pressures of the old empires starting to fragment, and the emergence of modern nation states. I think that gives a particular flavour, if you like, to what's happening then. So I wouldn't dispute that what you say about the earlier Spanish examples, but it seems to me there are strong grounds for also focusing on the late 19th, early 20th century cases too.
Questions?
Okay, I was wondering, how has the education systems of these societies worked prior to the establishment of the concentration camps? Are there any similarities or differences?
In their education systems?
Yes.
I'm not sure I can answer that question. What are you getting at?
One thing I noticed is when it came to societies, just from what I noticed, that when it comes to the implementation of policies toward placing people in certain camps, is that there seems to be a stigma toward, as you mentioned, there seems to be a stigma toward either racial or nationalism that results in these particular minorities being placed into these camps. And one thing I was quite curious to know is whether the populations who implement these policies, whether they were poorly educated or were they...
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. No, but okay, I understand what you're driving at. Well, if we're talking about the first half of the 20th century, then don't forget we're talking about states that haven't actually had a national education system for very long. These are new countries for the most part, and that even in the case of empires, the German Empire after 1870 and so on, the idea that you would create a single unified national education system was still very new. There's a famous book by Eugen Weber called Peasants into Frenchmen, which is about the creation of a unified notion of France from all the different regions, all speaking different languages, Breton, Provençal, and so on, all being brought together to speak proper French and to think like Frenchmen. And this is the same happens in Italy and in Germany and elsewhere. So what you see happening is a convergence of, or if you like, the education system represents in miniature the values of the state. So if you have a notion of a new state creating
a sense of unity and national homogeneity that has only been in place for a short space of time, the education system will reflect that. It's very much about driving people and channeling them in certain directions. You're no longer Breton, you're French, etc., etc. And that, of course, did create, is important for understanding the rise of nationalism and national identity. So I'm not a historian of education. I can't really say much more than that. But I think as representing the values of the modern nationalising state, then that's an important question. Would be a good research topic.
Thank you.
Can I tease you more on the definition?
Yeah, sure.
So when your definition says it is in a kind of without application of law, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about several societies like the Stalinist regime,
Yeah.
China, Nazi Germany, there are whether new laws in place
Yeah.
for these systems, or there's a reinterpretation of old laws using two-feeder systems.
Yeah.
So how does this fit your definition?
What I said was without due legal process.
Oh, you can-
Without due legal process, which means that there's no notion of appeal. There's no what we would recognise in a liberal rule of law as a process of law. So there's a mockery of law. There's a sentencing in the Gulag. It's kind of processing of legal cases where there's no hearing, no evidence. Just someone decides such and such is guilty there's a stamp that says such and such has committed this political crime and is going to be sent to Norilsk or Vorkuta or whatever. But there isn't really a trial. And I think something similar happens in the case of the Third Reich. When you're talking about the early camps, it's quite interesting. It's an interesting question because there's a sort of legal process, but there isn't really. The legal profession has been gleichgeschaltet and coordinated, and so there's no real. If in Nazi Germany Adolf Hitler is the law, as Hans Frank puts it, then there isn't really a proper legal process in the liberal sense of rule. There is a sort of rule of law, but only a sort of one.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. But I take the point. I think again that's an interesting. I think it does call into question the definition. See that. The whole point of the book. If you write a book like this, where it's a kind of condensation of global history into 35,000 words. What you can hope for, I think, is to get readers to ask questions like that, which then push up what you're saying and get them to ask their own questions. And you can't provide all the answers. You can't satisfactorily describe a phenomenon of this scale in that sort of space, possibly ever. So that's it's just it's a challenge to come up with some stuff that we find interesting.
Do we need to actually erase our minds from the German example? That's actually what you need to do in the book. And how can you accomplish it?
Yes and no. I do have a chapter on the Third Reich in the book because it's important in the same way that I think it would be, although you could say in genocide studies that if we focus on the Holocaust as our kind of archetypal genocide, then we won't really understand other cases properly. It would still be strange to write a book about genocide that didn't include the Holocaust, as a few people have thought about doing or have done. I think it's a rather odd decision. So I thought it would be strange to write a book about concentration camps and not talk about Nazi Germany. But in the book what I wanted to do was to try and say that Nazi Germany represents a particular instantiation of the world of camps. What the Nazis wanted to do was to create a society, as I put it in the book, modelled on the barracks. So the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft as the flip side of the exclusion of the racial enemies was also this creation of a kind of society as a kind of camp, in the sense that society run on military lines, where everything is ordered and people obey orders and are willing to die to obey orders and so on. That's, I think, that was important to write about. But I also tried to say, as I said in this talk now, that actually concentration camps don't all look like Dachau.
Most in Germany didn't look like that.
Right.
So
Yeah, quite. And especially when you start talking about the slave labour camps created from later in the war, the sub-camps of Gross-Rosen or Neuengamme. So then you have all sorts of strange industrial, small slave labour complexes. Very interesting to think about.
I just want to add a comment that I think that one of the real successes of the talk, and hopefully of the book when I read it, is that in the same way that you are arguing that philosophers or sociologists could benefit from historicizing what they mean by the camp, and you're historicizing and contextualizing the rise of these cases that you've discussed. I think that you also call on the listener and probably the reader to contextualize and historicize how they think about camps. I mean, it's sort of like we think we know a camp when we see it. And so some of the cases you describe are some of the cases I think about. I study Indonesia. Some of the cases I think about Indonesian prison camps and so on. I think well, that's a concentration camp. That's not a concentration camp. That's a concentration camp. But you're, I think you very persuasively, at least to this listener, have made me think about where do my own ideas about camps emerge from what context, and how can that be either challenged or broadened, or at least that I can be aware of the context, like my own historical context in thinking about it.
Good, thank you. That's a sort of theory of history position that I think is important to me, and I try to speak from whenever I write, which is to say that the role of history is not just to tell us some stuff about the past, but to make people think about their own place in the present and how they got there. And that, I think, is very important. And so if that succeeds in coming through, then I'm very happy about that. And do you know, what's his name, at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, Rudolf Mrazek, who writes on Indonesia. So some of his stuff on music in the Indonesian camps and so on is really, I haven't included it because I didn't know what to do with it, but it's really fascinating and completely, I think, gives you a different sense of what a camp is, what's going on in them. The way he writes that sort of intersection of anthropology and history, I find extremely fascinating. And so I'd like to have been able to use it, but it was sort of at the limits of what I can do. So
I think this was a very good conclusion. So I want just to mention, because I was asked to mention, that he was also brought here with the help of the UCLA and UB Center for Jewish Studies, so you all know. So thanks a lot for the talk, and I think we have a lot to think about, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.